Elizabeth Stillman's heart pounded against her ribs as the stagecoach hit another rut in the dusty road, jostling her weary body and sending fresh tears to her already swollen eyes. It was April 1876, and at 20 years of age, she had just made the most difficult decision of her life, fleeing her family's Boston home rather than submitting to marriage with Edwin Blackburn, a wealthy 52-year-old banker her father had chosen for her. The mountainous landscape of Colorado Territory gradually came into view as Elizabeth dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that had once belonged to her grandmother. She'd taken nothing but a small trunk containing her most practical clothing, a handful of family heirlooms, and the meager savings she'd managed to hide away over the years. Her father's parting words still burned in her ears. "You walk out that door, Elizabeth, and you are no longer my daughter." She had written to her aunt in Denver months before, confessing her fears about the arranged marriage. Her aunt's reply had been sympathetic but vague, offering little hope of sanctuary. With no specific destination in mind, Elizabeth had chosen Veta, Colorado, simply because it was far away and the train ticket was within her budget. Her knowledge of the place came solely from a small advertisement in a travel pamphlet claiming it to be a picturesque settlement nestled at the base of the Spanish Peaks. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of what appeared to be Veta's main street, a dusty stretch lined with wooden buildings, many with false fronts attempting to make them appear larger than they actually were. "Last stop, Veta," the driver called out. Elizabeth stepped down from the stagecoach, her legs stiff from the journey. The driver unceremoniously dropped her trunk beside her and tipped his hat before climbing back onto his perch. As the stagecoach pulled away, Elizabeth stood alone in the middle of the street, the enormity of her situation crashing down upon her. Veta was nothing like Boston. The air was thinner here, the sun harsher. People moved with purpose, their clothing dusty and practical. No one gave her a second glance as she stood there, a proper Boston lady in her traveling clothes, looking utterly lost. She spotted a building with a sign that read Veta Hotel and began dragging her trunk toward it. The trunk was heavier than she remembered, and she had only made it halfway across the street when the weight became too much. She paused, breathing heavily, unaccustomed to the altitude. "Need a hand with that, madam?" a deep voice asked from behind her. Elizabeth turned to find a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin looking down at her. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out kind eyes and a strong jaw covered with a few days' worth of stubble. He wore a dusty denim jacket over a faded blue shirt, with worn leather chaps over his pants and scuffed boots that had clearly seen many miles. Yes, thank you," she managed, embarrassed by her helplessness. The man picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Just arrived." "Yes." "I'm looking for accommodation." "The hotel's decent enough," he said, nodding toward the building she'd been heading for. "Mrs. Garsher runs it. She's fair with her prices." As they walked, Elizabeth stole glances at her helper. He moved with an easy confidence, his stride long and unhurried. "I'm Jacob Xavier," he said. "Most folks around here call me Jake." "Elizabeth Stillman," she replied automatically, before remembering she'd intended to use a different name to avoid being traced. "But I prefer to be called Eliza," she added quickly. They reached the hotel and Jake set her trunk down on the wooden porch. "Mrs. Garsha," he called through the open door. "You've got a new guest." A plump woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes, warm and curious, looked Elizabeth up and down. "This is Miss Stillman," Jake said. "Just arrived on the afternoon coach." Mrs. Garsha smiled. "Welcome to Veta, señorita. We have a nice room available, $1 a night includes breakfast. Elizabeth calculated quickly. Her limited funds wouldn't last more than 2 weeks at that rate. She needed to find work immediately. Thank you. I'll take it for now. After signing the register, Elizabeth was shown to a small but clean room on the second floor. Jake carried up her trunk, set it down by the narrow bed, and tipped his hat. "Town's small, but there's honest work if you're looking," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "The general store might be hiring, or the schoolhouse teacher left last month to get married." He paused at the door. "If you need anything, I've got a ranch about 3 miles west of town. Anyone can point you in the right direction." With that, he was gone, his boots echoing on the wooden stairs. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, overcome by exhaustion and uncertainty. In Boston, she'd been sheltered, her life planned out by her parents. Here, she was utterly alone. What did she know about work? About surviving in this harsh, beautiful place? Her father had always scoffed at the idea of women working, considering it beneath their station. The next morning, Elizabeth awoke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. After washing and dressing in her simplest skirt and blouse, she made her way downstairs to the small dining room where Mrs. Garsha served her a hearty breakfast of eggs, beans, and thick slices of bread. "You planning to stay in Veta long, Mrs. Garsha asked as she refilled Elizabeth's coffee cup. "I hope to," Elizabeth replied carefully. "I need to find work." Mrs. Garsha's eyebrows rose slightly. "You have experience?" Elizabeth hesitated. What skills did she actually have? She could play the piano, speak passable French, and so reasonably well, none of which seemed particularly useful here. "I'm a quick learner," she finally said. Mrs. Garsha's expression softened. "Everyone has to start somewhere, Nina. The general store might need help. Mr. Jenkins is getting old, and his eyes aren't what they used to be." Armed with this suggestion, Elizabeth set out to explore the town. Veta was indeed small, a handful of streets with wooden buildings in various states of repair. The general store stood near the center of town, its windows displaying a jumble of goods from tools to fabrics. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. An elderly man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning," Elizabeth said. "I'm looking for Mr. Jenkins." "You found him," the man replied, adjusting his spectacles. "What can I do for you, miss?" "I was told you might be looking for help in the store." Mr. Jenkins studied her for a moment. "You have experience in mercantile?" "No, sir, but I can read, write, and calculate figures accurately. I'm willing to learn and work hard." The old man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Don't know if I can afford help right now. Business has been slow since the mine cut back operations." Elizabeth's heart sank. "Perhaps I could work for a trial period. At a reduced wage." Before Mr. Jenkins could respond, the bell jangled again and Jake Xavier walked in, his tall frame filling the doorway. He nodded at Elizabeth, seemingly unsurprised to see her. "Morning, Jenkins." "Morning, Miss Stillman." "Jake," Mr. Jenkins greeted him. "What brings you to town today? Need some supplies. Fencing wire, nails, couple of new shirts." Jake's eyes darted to Elizabeth. "You finding everything all right in Veta?" "Actually, I was just inquiring about employment," she admitted. Jake leaned against the counter. "Jenkins, you'd be a fool not to hire her. Look at her, educated, well-spoken. Bet she could organize your ledgers better than you've ever had them." Mr. Jenkins frowned. "Don't need you telling me how to run my business, Xavier. Just offering an opinion." Jake shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. "Miss Stillman here seems like she'd be an asset." Elizabeth was both grateful for Jake's support and embarrassed by his forwardness. Mr. Jenkins sighed. "All right, 3 days trial, see if we suit each other. $2 a week to start, plus a 10% discount on store goods." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Elizabeth accepted gratefully, agreeing to begin the following morning. As she and Jake left the store together, she turned to him. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Xavier, though it wasn't necessary to speak for me," Jake chuckled. "Jenkins is a good man, but stubborn. Sometimes needs a little nudge in the right direction." He fell into step beside her as they walked down the boardwalk. $2 a week won't go far. Hotel's going to eat most of that. "I'm aware," Elizabeth replied, lifting her chin. "I'll manage, no doubt." He studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "There might be another option if you're interested." Elizabeth waited, wary but curious. "My ranch hand's wife, Grace, is expecting their third child. She could use help with the household and their 2 little ones. There's a small cabin on my property, nothing fancy, but it's weathertight and private. You could stay there in exchange for helping Grace a few hours each day." He quickly added, "It's a proper arrangement. My foreman Tom and Grace live in their own house on the property. I'm in the main house." Elizabeth considered the offer. It would solve her housing problem, but she barely knew this man. Why would you do this for a stranger? Jake's expression grew serious. "Everyone out here was a stranger once. Those who have been here longer have a duty to help newcomers find their footing." He paused. "Besides, Grace really does need the help. The last pregnancy was hard on her." After a moment's thought, Elizabeth nodded. "I'd like to meet Grace before deciding." "Fair enough. I'm heading back to the ranch after I finish my errands. You're welcome to ride along." 2 hours later, Elizabeth found herself in Jake's wagon, her trunk once again stowed behind them. The road out of town quickly became little more than a rutted trail winding through stands of pine and aspen trees. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the spring warmth. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth murmured, taking in the vast landscape. "Different from where you're from?" Jake asked, guiding the horses around a particularly deep rut. Elizabeth hesitated, reluctant to share too much of her past. "Yes, very different," Jake nodded, not pressing further. "The ranch isn't much to look at compared to some, but it's mine. Worked 6 years as a hand for old man Pritchard before he sold it to me 3 years ago. You must be proud to own your own land." "Every day," Jake agreed, "though it's a constant struggle. Weather, predators, cattle prices, always something trying to put you out of business." As they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view. A modest single-story house with a wide porch sat at the center of the property. Nearby stood a large barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings. In a grove of trees a short distance away, Elizabeth could make out 2 smaller cabins. "That's Tom and Grace's place," Jake said, pointing to the closer cabin, which had a small vegetable garden and children's toys scattered in the yard. "And that one further back would be yours, if you decide to stay." As they pulled up to Tom and Grace's cabin, a heavy-set woman with a kind face appeared in the doorway, one hand resting on her protruding belly. 2 small children peeked out from behind her skirts. Jake helped Elizabeth down from the wagon and made the introductions. "Grace, this is Miss Elizabeth Stillman. She's new in town, just started working for Jenkins. Miss Stillman, this is Grace Wilson." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and extended one to Elizabeth. "Pleased to meet you. Jake mentioned you might be staying in the old cabin." Her eyes were warm but appraising. "I'm considering it," Elizabeth replied. "Mr. Xavier said you might need some help." "Lord knows that's true," Grace chuckled. "These 2 keep me running from sunup to sundown, and with this one on the way." She patted her belly. "Come in, have some coffee, and we'll talk." Inside the cabin, Grace shooed her children 5-year-old Samuel and 3-year-old Lucy outside to play while she put a pot of coffee on the stove. The cabin was small but tidy, with handmade curtains and a colorful quilt on the bed in the corner. Jake says you're from back east, Grace said, setting mugs on the table. Elizabeth nodded, deciding to be honest but vague. Boston. I needed a change. Grace gave her a knowing look. Don't we all at some point? She didn't press for details, for which Elizabeth was grateful. The work wouldn't be difficult, helping with the washing, looking after the children when I need to rest, maybe some cooking. I used to do all the mending for the ranch hands too, but my fingers are too swollen these days. I can sew, Elizabeth offered. And I'm willing to learn whatever else is needed. After coffee and further conversation, Grace showed Elizabeth to the cabin that would be hers. It was indeed small, just one room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove. But it was clean, with its own water pump outside and a small privy behind it. It's not much, Grace apologized, but it's private. It's perfect, Elizabeth said, surprised to find she meant it. The simplicity appealed to her after the oppressive opulence of her family's Boston home. By the time Jake returned to drive her back to town, Elizabeth had made her decision. She would keep her job at the general store and move to the ranch, helping Grace in the mornings before heading to town for her afternoon shift with Mr. Jenkins. I'll come for you and your trunk tomorrow, Jake promised as he dropped her off at the hotel. Be ready around noon. That night, as Elizabeth prepared for bed in her hotel room, she felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She had no illusions about the difficulty of the path she'd chosen. The work would be hard, the accommodations spartan, and her future uncertain. Yet for the first time in her life, the decisions were hers alone. She thought of Jake Xavier's kind eyes and straightforward manner. He seemed genuinely good-hearted, offering help without expecting anything in return. In Boston, such behavior would have been suspect, laden with hidden motives. But here in this wild, beautiful place, perhaps things really were simpler. As promised, Jake arrived the next day to transport Elizabeth and her belongings to the ranch. Her first week passed in a blur of new experiences and aching muscles. Mornings were spent helping Grace with the endless cycle of domestic chores, washing, cooking, mending, and watching the children. Afternoons found her at the general store, learning the inventory and helping customers under Mr. Jenkins' watchful eye. By evening, she was exhausted but satisfied, returning to her small cabin to collapse into dreamless sleep. She saw Jake daily, usually in passing as he went about his ranch work. Sometimes he joined the communal dinner that Grace prepared for the ranch hands in the main house. Elizabeth quickly learned that Jake was respected by his workers, firm but fair, and always the first to tackle the hardest tasks. As spring deepened toward summer, Elizabeth settled into her new life. Her soft hands grew calloused, her pale skin tanned, and her formal speech relaxed into the more direct manner of the West. She found unexpected joy in simple pleasures: the mountain sunset viewed from her cabin door, the sound of coyotes in the distance, the satisfaction of a day's honest work completed. One evening in late May, Elizabeth sat on the small porch of her cabin, mending one of Jake's shirts that Grace had passed along to her. The day had been warm, but the evening brought a pleasant coolness. She heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see Jake walking toward her, leading his horse. "Evening, Miss Stillman," he called. "Mind some company?" "Not at all," she replied, setting aside her mending. "And please call me Eliza. Miss Stillman sounds so formal after all this time." Jake tied his horse to the hitching post and settled on the porch step beside her. "Eliza, then, how are you finding ranch life? Different from what I'm accustomed to, but not unpleasant," she smiled. "Grace is a patient teacher. You've taken to it well." "Jenkins says you're a natural with the customers," Elizabeth laughed. "I doubt that's what he said, but I appreciate the sentiment." She paused, then added, "Thank you again for giving me this opportunity." Jake looked out at the darkening landscape. "No need for thanks. You've earned your keep." He hesitated, then said, "I've been meaning to ask what brought you to Veta. Most folks don't end up here by accident." Elizabeth tensed, unsure how much to reveal. Jake had been nothing but kind, but her family's connections were far-reaching, if word got back to Boston about her whereabouts. As if sensing her discomfort, Jake added, "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. We all have our reasons for leaving places behind." Something in his tone made Elizabeth wonder about his own past. "Did you leave something behind?" she asked. A rueful smile crossed his face. "Nothing as dramatic as whatever you're running from, I'd wager. Just a father who thought ranching was a fool's errand and wanted me to work in his hardware store in Missouri." He shrugged. "I needed more sky above me than a store ceiling could provide." His honesty deserved some in return. "I was expected to marry a man my father chose," Elizabeth said quietly. "A business arrangement, essentially. When I refused, my family disowned me." Jake's jaw tightened. This man, he was unsuitable. "He was 52 years old and had buried 2 wives already," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the pain the memory still caused. "My father said I was being childish, that a good marriage wasn't about love but about security and position." "And what do you think a good marriage is about?" Elizabeth looked at him, surprised by the direct question. "I believe it should have both love and respect. Partners should face life's challenges together as equals in their own way." Jake nodded slowly. "Sounds reasonable to me." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "It's getting late. I should let you rest." As he untied his horse, he turned back. "There's a town social on Saturday. Dancing, food, that sort of thing. You might enjoy meeting more of the locals." He paused, then added almost casually, "I'd be happy to escort you if you'd like." Elizabeth felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. "I'd like that very much." Jake tipped his hat. "I'll pick you up at 6 then. Good night, Eliza." "Good night, Jake." As his figure receded into the darkness, Elizabeth remained on her porch, a strange mix of anticipation and trepidation swirling within her. Was this a simple neighborly gesture or something more? And if it was more, was she ready for it? Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Elizabeth spent the morning helping Grace with the children while Tom worked with Jake, and the other hands moving cattle to the upper pasture. After her shift at the general store, she returned to her cabin with just enough time to prepare for the social. She unpacked her one good dress, a cornflower blue cotton with white lace trim that had been considered too plain for Boston society, but was likely too fancy for a Veta gathering. After washing with her precious soap, she dressed and arranged her hair in a simple but flattering style, pinning it up at the sides and letting it fall in gentle waves down her back. At precisely 6 o'clock, she heard a horse approaching. Looking out her window, she saw Jake riding up, dressed in clean dark pants, a crisp white shirt, and a vest. His usual work hat had been replaced by a newer one, and his boots were polished to a shine. Elizabeth's heart quickened at the sight of him. In the 2 months since she'd arrived in Veta, she'd grown to admire Jake Xavier, his quiet confidence, his kindness, his unwavering work ethic. But tonight, seeing him dressed in his best, she had to admit that her feelings had grown into something stronger than mere admiration. She stepped outside as he dismounted. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very handsome yourself." Jake helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, his arm around her waist to steady her as they rode toward town. The propriety she'd been raised with told her this was scandalously intimate, but she found she didn't care. The town hall was decorated with lanterns and wildflowers. Inside, tables laden with food lined one wall, while a small group of musicians played lively tunes on fiddles and guitars. The room was already crowded with townspeople of all ages, from elderly couples to young families with children. As Jake led Elizabeth in, several people called out greetings. He introduced her around, and she was met with friendly curiosity rather than the judgmental scrutiny she'd feared. Mr. Jenkins nodded approvingly when Jake brought her over to where he sat with his wife. "Miss Stillman has been a godsend at the store," he told Jake. "Sharp mind, good with the customers. Reorganized my entire inventory system." "I'm not surprised," Jake replied, smiling down at Elizabeth. "She's a remarkable woman." The evening passed in a pleasant blur of conversation, laughter, and dancing. Jake proved to be an unexpectedly graceful dancer, guiding Elizabeth confidently through waltzes and lively reels. During a break in the music, they stepped outside for some fresh air. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Jake asked as they walked a little way from the hall. "Very much," Elizabeth replied honestly. "Everyone has been so welcoming. That's Veta for you, small town, big hearts." He paused, then added, "Though I should warn you there will be talk after tonight." "Talk? About us," Jake clarified. "Me bringing you to the social, dancing every dance with you. In a small town, that's practically a declaration." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. "A declaration of what, exactly?" Jake turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Of my interest in you, Eliza. Which I suspect you've already noticed." She had, of course, though she tried to convince herself she was imagining it. "I've noticed," she admitted softly. And his voice was steady, but she could sense the tension beneath it. "And I share that interest." The words felt both terrifying and liberating. Jake's smile was slow and warm. "Good, that's good." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm not a man for fancy words, Eliza, but I think you're extraordinary. The way you've adapted to life here, how hard you work, your kindness to Grace and the children, I've never met anyone like you." Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "I think you're extraordinary too, Jake Xavier. Not many men would have helped a stranger the way you helped me." He leaned closer, his voice low. "May I kiss you, Eliza?" Her heart hammering, she nodded. His lips were warm and firm against hers, the kiss tender but brief, mindful of their public location. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with an emotion that sent a shiver through her. "We should get back inside before they send out a search party," he murmured. The rest of the evening passed in a happy haze. Elizabeth was aware of curious glances and knowing smiles from the townspeople, but found she didn't mind. This wasn't Boston, with its rigid social rules and judgmental whispers. These people seemed genuinely pleased to see Jake's interest in her. As they rode back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Elizabeth leaned back slightly into Jake's solid presence. For the first time since fleeing Boston, she felt a sense of real possibility, not just surviving, but perhaps finding happiness in this new life. Jake helped her down from the horse when they reached her cabin, but kept hold of her hand after her feet touched the ground. "I'd like to court you properly, Eliza Stillman," he said, his voice husky in the darkness. "If you'll allow it." Elizabeth smiled up at him. "I'd like that very much." He kissed her again, longer this time, his arms encircling her waist as hers went around his neck. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster. "Good night, Eliza," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Good night, Jake." She watched him ride away toward the main house, her heart fuller than it had been in years. Whatever came next, she knew she was no longer alone. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship. Jake began taking his evening meals at Grace and Tom's cabin when his ranch work allowed, giving him the opportunity to spend time with Elizabeth in a proper setting. On Sundays, they rode into town together for church services, afterward often enjoying a picnic by the creek that ran near the ranch. Elizabeth learned more about Jake's past, how he'd left Missouri at 19 to work as a cowhand, drifting through Texas and New Mexico before settling in Colorado. He spoke little of his family, except to say that his father had remarried after his mother's death, and now had a new family that didn't include him. The quiet pain in his voice when he mentioned this made Elizabeth reach for his hand, recognizing in him the same sense of familial rejection she herself felt. In turn, she shared more of her own story, describing her sheltered upbringing and her father's increasing control as she'd reached marriageable age. She told him about Edwin Blackburn's cold, assessing eyes and clammy hands, how he'd spoken of her to her father as if she were a prized mare being purchased for breeding. "I couldn't do it," she confessed as they sat by the creek one Sunday afternoon. "I couldn't imagine spending my life with him, bearing his children, subjecting myself to his attentions." She blushed at her own boldness in mentioning such things. Jake's jaw tightened, his hand squeezing hers. "You were right to refuse. No one should be forced into such a union." "My father didn't see it that way. He said I was throwing away my future, that no respectable man would want me if I defied him in this." "Your father was wrong," Jake said firmly. "About many things, it seems." As June turned to July, the heat settled over the valley like a wool blanket. Ranch work intensified with haying season, and Elizabeth found herself helping Grace preserve vegetables from their garden for the coming winter. Despite the hard work, she found herself happier than she could remember being. Her body grew stronger, her mind clearer away from the stifling constraints of her former life. Her feelings for Jake deepened into something she recognized as love, though neither had spoken the word aloud. There was a deliberateness to their courtship, a careful building of trust and understanding that felt more meaningful than the rushed, superficial romances she'd observed in Boston society. One sweltering afternoon in mid-July, Elizabeth was returning from town after her shift at the store when she noticed an unfamiliar carriage parked outside the main ranch house. Curious, she directed her steps that way instead of toward her cabin. As she approached, she heard raised voices from inside. One was Jake's, tense with anger. The other belonged to a man she didn't recognize. "Absolutely refuse to allow it," Jake was saying as she reached the porch. "You have no right." "She is my daughter," the other man replied coldly. "I have every right." Elizabeth froze, her blood turning to ice despite the summer heat. She knew that voice. It belonged to her father, George Stillman. The screen door opened and Jake stormed out, his face dark with anger. He stopped short when he saw her standing there, his expression shifting to concern. "Eliza," he began, but was cut off by the appearance of another figure in the doorway. George Stillman stood tall and imposing, his expensive suit incongruous against the rustic backdrop of the ranch house. His cold gray eyes fixed on Elizabeth with a mixture of triumph and disdain. "Elizabeth," he said, "it's time to come home." Elizabeth took an involuntary step backward. "How did you find me? Did you really think you could disappear?" "A private detective traced you to Denver, and from there it was simply a matter of following your trail." Her father stepped fully onto the porch. "This childish tantrum has gone on long enough. You've made your point. Now it's time to return to your responsibilities." Jake moved to stand beside Elizabeth, his presence steadying. "Miss Stillman isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go," he said, his voice level but hard. George Stillman's gaze flicked dismissively over Jake. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. This is a family matter." "You forfeited any right to call me family when you disowned me," Elizabeth said, finding her voice at last. "I'm not going back with you." Her father's expression hardened. "Don't be foolish, Elizabeth. What kind of life do you imagine you can have here? Working in a general store? Living in a shack?" His lip curled as he surveyed the ranch. "Is this what you've reduced yourself to?" "I've raised myself up, not reduced myself," Elizabeth replied, her chin lifting. "For the first time in my life, I'm making my own choices, including this man." Her father gestured toward Jake with undisguised contempt. "Do you think I don't see what's happening here? He's using you, Elizabeth. What better prize for a penniless rancher than a girl from a wealthy family?" Jake tensed beside her, but Elizabeth spoke before he could. "Jake didn't know anything about my family until you showed up. He helped me when I had nothing to offer in return." George Stillman scoffed. "You're more naive than I thought if you believe that. Men like him always have ulterior motives." "That's enough," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've said your piece, Mr. Stillman. Elizabeth has made her choice. I suggest you respect it and leave." "Or what?" Her father's tone was mocking. "Will you force me off your property, Cowboy? I could buy and sell this entire valley without denting my accounts." Elizabeth had never seen Jake truly angry before, but she could feel the rage emanating from him now, controlled but powerful. Before the situation could escalate further, she placed a hand on his arm. "Jake, please let me speak with my father alone." Jake looked down at her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I'm sure." After a moment's hesitation, Jake inclined his head. "I'll be right over there if you need me," he said, indicating the nearby corral before walking away, his back stiff with tension. When they were alone, Elizabeth turned to her father. "Nothing you say will convince me to return to Boston." "You don't understand what's at stake," her father said, his voice dropping. "The Blackburn merger is essential to our family's financial survival. Without it, we face ruin." Elizabeth stared at him in shock. "What are you saying?" George Stillman ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking older. "The bank is in trouble. Bad investments, loans that weren't repaid. Edwin Blackburn's capital is the only thing that can save us from complete collapse. Your marriage to him was the condition of his investment. So I was to be sold to save the family fortune." Elizabeth's voice rose with indignation. "Did Mother know about this?" "Your mother knows what she needs to know," her father replied stiffly. "The point is, Elizabeth, this isn't just about you. Your sister's futures, the family name, dozens of employees who depend on the bank, all will suffer if you persist in this selfishness." Elizabeth felt the familiar weight of guilt and obligation pressing down on her. All her life, she'd been taught that family duty superseded personal desires. For a moment, she wavered. Then she looked over at Jake, who stood watching from a distance, his concern for her evident even from afar. In the months she'd known him, he'd never once tried to control her or make her choices for her. He'd offered help without demands, support without conditions. He'd shown her what real respect looked like. "I'm sorry about the bank," she said finally, turning back to her father. "Truly, I am. But I won't sacrifice my life to save it. There must be another way." "There isn't." Her father's voice was flat. "But I see you've made your choice, living in squalor with your cowboy over your family's welfare." "This isn't squalor," Elizabeth replied, gesturing around at the ranch with its neat buildings and productive fields. "This is honest work and a life built with one's own hands. There's dignity in that, something you never taught me to value." George Stillman's face hardened into the cold mask she knew so well. "Very well. Consider yourself fully disinherited, Elizabeth. When you inevitably realize your mistake, don't come crawling back." "I won't," she said quietly. Without another word, her father turned and stalked back to his waiting carriage. Elizabeth watched as the driver whipped the horses into motion, sending dust billowing as they departed down the ranch road. Jake approached cautiously as the carriage disappeared from view. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elizabeth nodded, though tears had begun to spill down her cheeks. "He's gone. I don't think he'll be back." Jake drew her into his arms, holding her as she cried, not for the loss of her father's approval, which she'd already mourned, but for the finality of the break. Whatever slim hope she'd harbored of eventual reconciliation was gone. "I'm sorry," Jake murmured into her hair. "I know how hard that must have been." When her tears subsided, Elizabeth looked up at him. "Did you mean what you said, about me not going anywhere I don't want to go?" "Every word," Jake replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Eliza, I want you to stay, but only if that's what you want too. Your choices are your own always." In that moment, with the summer sun warming her skin and Jake's arms around her, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she wanted to be. "I want to stay," she whispered. "With you." Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good," he said simply, before lowering his lips to hers. That evening, as they sat on the porch of Elizabeth's cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Jake took her hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what your father said." Elizabeth tensed. "Which part?" "About me having ulterior motives." Jake's thumb traced circles on her palm. "He was wrong about my knowing who you were, but he wasn't entirely wrong about my intentions toward you." Elizabeth looked at him questioningly. "I do want something from you, Eliza. Something I've wanted since that town social, maybe even before." He took a deep breath. "I want to build a life with you as your husband if you'll have me." Elizabeth's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Jake, I know it's soon," he hurried on, "and I'm not a wealthy man. This ranch is all I have to offer. It's a hard life sometimes, and I can't promise it will ever be easy. But I can promise to love you, respect you, and stand beside you through whatever comes." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "That's all I've ever wanted," she whispered. "Someone to stand beside, not behind or beneath." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring with a single, modest pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Not fancy, but given with love." "It's perfect," Elizabeth said as he slipped it onto her finger. Jake's kiss was a promise, sealed beneath the vast Colorado sky that had become her home. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Veta. Grace was delighted, already treating Elizabeth like a sister. Mr. Jenkins offered gruff congratulations and, to Elizabeth's surprise, a small raise. "Can't have the future Mrs. Xavier working for pennies," he explained. They were married in early September, when the aspen trees had just begun to turn gold. The ceremony took place on the ranch, with Reverend Miller from the Veta church officiating. The entire town seemed to attend, bringing food, music, and well wishes. Elizabeth wore a simple cream-colored dress that she and Grace had sewn together, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Jake wore a new suit purchased for the occasion, looking both handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of aspen boughs, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness that transcended the pain of her family's rejection. Here, surrounded by people who had accepted her based on her character rather than her connections, she had found her true home. The celebration lasted well into the night, with dancing and laughter under lantern light. When Jake finally swept her away to the main house now, their shared home, Elizabeth felt none of the trepidation she would have felt as Edwin Blackburn's bride. Instead, she went willingly into her husband's arms, discovering the joy of physical love freely given and gratefully received. The months that followed were filled with adjustments and discoveries, as they learned to live together as husband and wife. Jake's habit of leaving his boots in the middle of the floor competed with Elizabeth's tendency to lose herself in a book and forget the bread baking in the oven. They argued sometimes he thought she worked too hard. She thought he took too many risks, but they always found their way back to each other by nightfall. In October, Grace delivered a healthy baby boy whom she and Tom named William. Elizabeth found herself spending hours at their cabin, helping with the newborn and his siblings, learning skills she hoped to need herself before too long. Winter descended on the ranch with a fury that Elizabeth, despite warnings, wasn't fully prepared for. Snow piled high around the buildings, and temperatures dropped so low that water froze in buckets inside the house. Jake worked tirelessly to keep the cattle fed and protected, often returning home exhausted and half-frozen himself. Elizabeth learned to manage the house through the harsh conditions, keeping the fires burning, melting snow for washing when the pump froze, preparing hearty meals to sustain Jake and the hands through their grueling days. The work was harder than anything she'd done before, but there was satisfaction in mastering these skills, in being truly useful. One stormy February night, as wind howled around the eaves and snow pelted the windows, Elizabeth sat by the fire darning socks while Jake cleaned his rifle at the table. The comfortable silence between them was broken when Jake looked up suddenly. "I never asked if you regretted it," he said. Elizabeth paused in her work. "Regretted what? Leaving Boston? Your family? The life you would have had there?" She set aside her darning and crossed to where he sat, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Not for a moment," she said firmly. "Do you know what my life would have been with Edwin Blackburn? Social events I didn't care about, conversations that meant nothing, children raised by servants while their father ignored them and their mother withered away from neglect." Jake's hands came up to cover hers. "And your life here? With cold so fierce it cracks the window panes and work that never ends." Elizabeth leaned down to kiss him softly. "My life here has purpose and love. I wouldn't trade it for all the comfort in the world." As spring returned to the valley, bringing new calves and fresh green growth, Elizabeth confirmed what she had suspected for weeks: she was expecting their first child. Jake's joy at the news was tempered with concern for her welfare, but Elizabeth assured him that she was strong and healthy. "Women have been having babies on ranches for generations," she reminded him. "I'll be fine." Nevertheless, Jake insisted on bringing in a midwife from Trinidad to examine her and provide guidance. Mrs. Hernandez, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, pronounced Elizabeth to be in excellent health and likely to deliver without complications. "Strong hips, good color, young and healthy," she declared. "Just keep eating well and stay active, but rest when you need to." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer, though the heat sometimes made Elizabeth uncomfortable. Jake took to bringing her wildflowers when he returned from working in the fields, placing them in jars around the house to brighten her days. He also insisted that she reduce her workload, hiring a local girl to help with the heavier household tasks. In late November, just as the first snow dusted the mountains, Elizabeth gave birth to a son after a long but uncomplicated labor. They named him David Thomas Xavier, after Jake's father and their foreman Tom. Holding her son in her arms with Jake beside her, his face awestruck as he gently touched the baby's tiny fingers, Elizabeth felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. This was family, not the cold, duty-bound version she had known in Boston, but something warmer and truer. "He's perfect," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're both perfect." Elizabeth smiled up at him, exhausted but radiant. "We did this together," she said. "And we'll raise him together." David grew into a sturdy, curious toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's expressive eyes. He followed Jake around the ranch whenever possible, solemnly observing the work and attempting to mimic his father's movements. Elizabeth taught him his letters early, reading to him each night from the small collection of books she'd accumulated. The ranch prospered under Jake's careful management, allowing them to add a second bedroom to the house and make other modest improvements. Elizabeth continued to help at the general store 1 day a week, enjoying the connection to the town and the opportunity to use her organizational skills. In the spring of 1879, when David was just over 2 years old, Elizabeth received a letter that shook her hard-won peace. It came from her youngest sister, Margaret, now 18. "Father is dead," the letter began without preamble. "Heart failure, the doctors said, though I think it was really the stress of the bank's collapse. Mother is moving in with Aunt Judith. The house and most of the furnishings have been sold to pay debts." Elizabeth sat heavily in a kitchen chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Jake found her there when he came in for the midday meal, tears streaming down her face. "Eliza, what is it?" he asked, alarmed, crossing quickly to her side. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. As he read, his expression softened from concern to understanding. He set the letter aside and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I'm sorry about your father," he said simply. Elizabeth nodded, wiping at her tears. "I'm not crying for him, not really. We said our goodbyes long ago. I'm crying for what might have been the family we could have had if he'd been a different sort of man." Jake squeezed her hands. "Do you want to go to Boston?" "For the funeral, or to see your mother and sisters?" The question gave her pause. Did she want to return to the city that had once been her home, to face the society that had likely gossiped about her disgrace, to see her mother, who had never stood against her father's decisions? "No," she said finally. "There's nothing for me there anymore, but I do want to write to my sisters, especially Margaret. She sounds lost." Jake nodded. "Whatever you want to do, I'm with you." That evening, Elizabeth wrote long letters to each of her 3 sisters, describing her life in Colorado, her happiness with Jake, and their beautiful son. She enclosed a small photograph of the 3 of them that had been taken in Veta the previous Christmas. To Margaret, the youngest, she added a special invitation. "If you should ever find yourself in need of a change, or simply wish to see a different part of the country, know that you would be welcome here. Our home is modest compared to what you're accustomed to, but it is filled with love and laughter." She didn't truly expect anything to come of the invitation, so when a response arrived just 3 weeks later, she was surprised. Margaret's letter was filled with questions about Colorado, about ranch life, about what skills might be useful there. It ended with a tentative query. "Do you think I might come for a visit this summer, just for a month or so? I find I cannot bear the thought of another Boston season, especially now that we have no money to speak of." Jake was supportive when Elizabeth showed him the letter. "Family is important," he said. "If your sister needs a place to find her feet, we have room." In June, Margaret arrived on the afternoon stagecoach, looking both exhausted from travel and overwhelmed by her new surroundings. She was a slender young woman with the same honey-brown hair as Elizabeth, though her eyes were darker and more guarded. Elizabeth embraced her sister warmly. "Welcome to Veta," she said, "and to our home." Jake tipped his hat politely, then took charge of Margaret's trunk, loading it into the wagon while the sisters exchanged news of family and Boston acquaintances. On the ride to the ranch, Margaret fell silent, taking in the vast landscape with wide eyes. "It's so big," she finally said, "and wild." Elizabeth smiled. "You get used to it. The space becomes comforting rather than intimidating." Margaret adjusted quickly to ranch life, proving more adaptable than Elizabeth had expected. She took to little David immediately, delighting him with games and stories. She also showed an unexpected aptitude for horsemanship, taking lessons from Tom whenever he could spare the time. "She's got a natural seat," Tom told Elizabeth one evening as they watched Margaret ride the gentle mare Jake had assigned to her. "Could be a real horsewoman with more practice." As the weeks passed, Margaret lost the pinched, anxious look she'd arrived with. Her skin tanned from hours spent outdoors, and her laughter came more frequently. When the month she'd planned to stay drew to a close, she approached Elizabeth with hesitation. "You think, would it be possible for me to stay longer?" she asked. "I'm not ready to go back." "Of course you can stay," Elizabeth assured her, "for as long as you need." Summer turned to fall, and Margaret showed no signs of wanting to return east. She made herself useful around the ranch, helping with household tasks, and even assisting at the general store when Mr. Jenkins was short-handed. The townspeople accepted her as they had Elizabeth, drawing her into the community with easy friendliness. In October, a cattle buyer named Gabriel Sullivan arrived from Denver to negotiate the purchase of some of Jake's stock. A tall man with auburn hair and thoughtful green eyes, Gabriel was educated and well-spoken, but comfortable in the rough setting of the ranch. He took his meals with the family during his 3-day stay, engaging Margaret in conversations about books and music that left her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. Before he departed, Gabriel asked Jake's permission to write to Margaret. Jake, after a measured look at the younger man, granted it with a warning that was only half joking. "My wife is mighty fond of her sister. You'd best have honorable intentions." Gabriel's letters arrived regularly after that, each one eagerly received by Margaret. By Christmas, it was clear to everyone that a courtship was underway, conducted largely through correspondence, but occasionally in person when Gabriel's business brought him to Veta. One snowy evening in January 1880, as the family sat around the fire after dinner, Margaret announced that Gabriel had asked her to marry him. "And what did you tell him?" Elizabeth asked, though the radiance of her sister's face made the answer obvious. "I told him yes," Margaret replied, her voice trembling with happiness. "If you and Jake approve." Jake smiled at his sister-in-law. "Sullivan's a good man, hard-working, honest. If you love him, you have our blessing." Margaret and Gabriel were married in the spring, in the same spot where Elizabeth and Jake had exchanged their vows nearly 4 years earlier. After the ceremony, the newlyweds departed for Denver, where Gabriel had recently purchased a small ranch of his own. "Thank you," Margaret whispered to Elizabeth as they embraced goodbye, "for showing me there was another way to live, for giving me the courage to find happiness." Elizabeth wiped away a tear as she watched her sister's carriage disappear down the road. "She'll be all right," Jake said, his arm around her waist. "I know," Elizabeth replied. "We both found our way." That summer brought another joyful development. Elizabeth was expecting their second child. David, now 4, was excited about becoming a big brother, solemnly promising to help care for the baby. In February 1881, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Grace Xavier. She had Jake's dark eyes but Elizabeth's delicate features, and from the beginning showed a determined spirit that made them both laugh. "She knows what she wants," Jake said as he watched the infant stubbornly refuse the bottle Elizabeth was attempting to introduce. "Like her mother." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "I prefer to think of it as knowing my own mind," Jake grinned. "That's what I said." As their children grew, so did the ranch. Jake was able to purchase additional acreage, expanding their herd and their prosperity. Elizabeth started a small school on the property, teaching not only their own children but those of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders. Her reputation as an educator spread, and eventually the town council approached her about taking over the vacant position of schoolteacher in Veta. "You should do it," Jake encouraged when she hesitated. "You're a natural teacher and the children need you. But what about our own children? The house?" Jake shook his head. "We'll manage. David is old enough for town school now anyway, and Sarah can come with you. As for me and the house, I managed before you came along, didn't I?" So Elizabeth became the Veta school teacher, riding into town each morning with her children and returning in the afternoon. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, allowing her to use her education in a way that benefited the community that had welcomed her. In the summer of 1883, a letter arrived from Boston that brought unexpected news. Elizabeth's oldest sister, Catherine, wrote that their mother was gravely ill and asking for Elizabeth. "She may not have much time left," Catherine wrote. "I know there has been distance between you, but I believe she sincerely wishes to make peace before the end." Elizabeth sat with the letter for several days, torn between long-buried resentment and a daughter's natural desire for reconciliation. Jake, as always, offered support without pressure. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you," he said. "If you want to go, we'll find a way to make it happen." In the end, Elizabeth chose to make the journey, taking 7-year-old David with her but leaving Sarah, not quite 3, with Jake. The train ride east was a strange experience, each mile bringing her closer to a past she had deliberately left behind. David, who had never seen anything but the mountains and plains of Colorado, pressed his face to the window in wonder as the landscape changed. Boston was both familiar and foreign when they arrived. The narrow streets, the brick buildings, the formality of dress and manner all brought back memories, not all of them pleasant. Catherine met them at the station, embracing Elizabeth warmly despite the years of separation. "He's the image of his father, I expect," she said, looking down at David with a smile. "Though he has your eyes." Their mother was indeed failing, her once commanding presence diminished by illness to a frail figure in a large bed. When Elizabeth entered the room, Ellen Stillman's eyes filled with tears. "Elizabeth," she whispered, "you came." "I came, Mother," Elizabeth replied, sitting beside the bed and taking her mother's thin hand. "I should have stood up for you," Ellen said, her voice weak but determined. "When you refused Edwin Blackburn, when your father disowned you, I was a coward." Elizabeth squeezed her mother's hand. "You were in an impossible position." "No," Ellen shook her head slightly. "There is always a choice. I chose wrong, but you chose right. Are you happy, my dear? Truly happy?" "Yes, Mother. I have a good husband who respects me, 2 beautiful children, work that matters. I am very happy." A tear slipped down Ellen's cheek. "Then I can go in peace." Elizabeth stayed in Boston for 2 weeks, until her mother passed quietly in her sleep. The funeral was small, attended mainly by family and a few longtime friends. The once extensive Stillman social circle had largely disappeared with the family's financial downfall. After the funeral, Elizabeth spent time with her sisters, rebuilding connections strained by time and distance. Catherine, now a widow with a modest income from her late husband's investments, was considering a move to New York, where opportunities for women were somewhat more progressive. Anne, the middle sister, was contentedly married to a professor at Harvard and had 2 young sons. Before returning to Colorado, Elizabeth visited her father's grave, a simple stone in the family plot. She stood there for a long time, not speaking, simply acknowledging the complex mixture of emotions she still felt toward the man who had both given her life and tried to control it. "Goodbye, Father," she finally said. "I hope you found peace." The return journey to Colorado felt like coming home in a way the trip to Boston never had. As the train crossed the prairie and the mountains appeared on the horizon, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness settle over her. David, too, grew more animated the closer they got to Veta. Jake and Sarah were waiting at the station when they arrived, Sarah bouncing with excitement and Jake's face breaking into a wide smile at the sight of them. As he gathered Elizabeth into a tight embrace, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. "Welcome home," he murmured against her hair. "It's good to be home," she replied, meaning every word. The years that followed brought both joys and sorrows, as all lives do. The ranch prospered, allowing them to build a larger house with proper bedrooms for the children, and even a small library for Elizabeth's growing collection of books. Jake's reputation as a cattleman grew, and he was elected to the town council, where his practical wisdom was highly valued. David grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's affinity for ranching but his mother's love of learning. At 16, he announced his intention to attend college in Denver to study modern agricultural techniques before returning to help run the family ranch. Sarah, spirited and independent, showed an early talent for medicine, setting splints for injured animals and assisting the local doctor whenever he would allow it. By the time she was 15, it was clear she was destined for medical training, despite the obstacles women faced in the profession. In 1890, when Elizabeth was 34 and Jake 38, they welcomed their third child, a son they named Michael James Xavier. He was an unexpected blessing, arriving long after they'd assumed their family was complete. "Life still has surprises for us," Jake said as they watched the infant sleeping in his cradle. Elizabeth smiled, leaning against her husband's solid shoulder. "Good ones, I hope." "Mostly good," Jake agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I expect this young man will keep us on our toes well into our old age." As the 19th century drew to a close, Elizabeth sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Veta nearly 25 years earlier would hardly recognize the confident, capable woman she had become. Yet in the most important ways, she was still the same, still determined to live life on her own terms, still believing in the power of love freely given and received. The difference was that now she had the wisdom of experience to temper her youthful idealism, and the steady support of a man who had never once asked her to be less than she was. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jake surprised Elizabeth with a gift, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of their 3 children. As he fastened it around her neck, his fingers lingered on her skin. "Happy?" he asked, a question he still posed occasionally, as if to reassure himself that she had no regrets. Elizabeth turned in his arms, looking up into the face that had grown more dear to her with each passing year. The boyish cowboy who had helped her with her trunk that first day in Veta was now a man in his prime, with streaks of silver at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes that she found endlessly attractive. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "You?" Jake's smile was slow and warm, the same smile that had first captured her heart so many years ago. "More than I ever thought possible." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sunset paint the Spanish peaks with gold, Elizabeth knew that her greatest act of courage had not been leaving Boston, but opening her heart to love and possibility in this wild, beautiful land. It had given her everything her younger self had longed for: a true partnership, work that mattered, a family bound by love rather than obligation. It wasn't the life she had been raised to expect. It was immeasurably better.